What do we mean when we use the phrase coming out of the closet? It's one of those terms that has become ubiquitous in queer circles. But where does the phrase originate? It's hard to get a clear answer for that. In Gay New York, Gender, Urban Culture, and the Making of the Gay Male World, George Chauncey describes how the first half of that phrase came to be. In the early 20th century, coming out was a term that gay New York men borrowed from debutantes of the time. Just as young, elite women would present themselves to society before joining their ranks, so too would gay men who were new to gay life in New York. The second half of that phrase is a little trickier. It seems to derive from the idiom of skeletons in the closet, that one's gender or sexuality is something secret or shameful. Therefore, coming out of the closet is a bit of a portmanteau. It reveals the way that coming to terms and revealing one's identity can reveal new worlds of possibility, but also how it's shrouded in pain for many. How do we as queer people navigate that contradiction? Should you come out, even if it could lead to rejection, violence, or abandonment? And what does it even mean to come out? Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start at the beginning.
Growing up in South Texas in the mid-2000s, I didn't really know a lot of gay people. I know, shocker. I don't know if I even really knew what gay meant at the time. I mean, I had cable. I saw TV shows that had gay characters in them. But if I went in a time machine and tried to talk to 10-year-old Samantha and ask her to describe a gay person, she'd probably say someone who wears a lot of pink and likes fashion and shimmies when they walk. And that's not even to mention lesbians, which I don't really remember lesbians at all from my childhood. I don't really know if I even knew that gay was something a woman could be, which is just compulsory heterosexuality in action for you. If you're unfamiliar with the term, comphet is an idea that was first written about by Adrienne Rich in her 1980 essay, Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence, in which she describes the way that women's sexuality is so centered around men that the idea that they could be attracted to women isn't even on women's radar because they're so focused on appealing to men. They're seen as not really having a sexuality outside of being sexual for men. Because of this male centering, it tends to take queer women a longer time to realize that they're queer. When you're told from a very young age to change everything about yourself, from your personality to your wardrobe to your body shape, just to please men, the idea that you might not even be attracted to them takes a while. Funnily enough, I went through most of my adolescence never questioning or considering that I could be anything but 100% straight. And the only reason that I did start to consider it is because I had a close female friend who admitted that she had feelings for me. And when I turned her down, she asked, okay, are you turning me down because you're not into me specifically? Or are you turning me down because you're not into girls in general? Huh. Well, you got me there, Chief. So that led me down a few months of soul searching where I really looked into myself and considered things. And then by the end of that soul searching, I could proudly say that I wasn't into her specifically. Sorry, buddy. So now, a time for the grand coming out, right? Who to tell? How to tell? But also, why did I have to tell anyone? Why did I have to have a coming out?
The terms heterosexual and homosexual are not old ideas. They were first described in the German text Psychopathia Sexualis in 1892. The terms didn't begin to be widely used in the United States until later on. Before then, people weren't really considered homosexual as an identity. It was more an activity one engaged in. Think of it as the difference between someone who plays video games and someone who calls themselves a gamer.
Point being that the idea of gay as identity didn't start to appear until late 19th, early 20th century Germany.
The German Institute of Sexology was revolutionary for its research into homosexuality and gender transition. They were among the first to develop gender reassignment surgery and hormone treatment. The reason you've probably never heard of them is because the Nazis hated them. If you've seen images of Nazi book burnings, it's probably research from the Institute of Sexology. They burned over 30,000 pieces of literature in just one raid, claiming the text to be of un-German spirit. I guess the fascist playbook doesn't change that much.
Even with the Nazis' efforts to try and stop them, the Institute of Sexology was able to establish homosexuality and transgenderism as things that people just were, that people just existed in the world as that. So we'll take that foundational idea, skip a decade or two, and go back to the US, where early LGBT organizations are just beginning to form.
These early groups, like the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis, were first formed in the 1950s more as social clubs, where members secretly gathered so they could meet and make friends with other people like themselves. Both groups also created underground magazines known as zines, where they could write about their ideas surrounding sexuality and gender. As these groups matured, they began to argue that homosexuals were a group of Americans that deserved full civil rights. This was the early 1960s, where many other groups of marginalized people were arguing to be treated fairly, and these organizations argued that homosexuals were just another civil rights group.
And then Stonewall happened. Do I have to talk about Stonewall? Do I have to explain Stonewall to you? Look, Stonewall is important. Stonewall has an important place, especially in American queer history, but it has been mythologized and centered to the point that anytime I try to read about queer history from another place, it gets described as the Stonewall of Canada or the Stonewall of LA, and it gets kind of tiring.
It's 1969 in New York City, and you are a queer person who wants a night out and maybe to get laid. Your only option is seedy, mafia-run clubs that are often raided by cops. Said cops will likely beat and then arrest you before putting your name and face in the local newspaper. If you're lucky, this will be simply humiliating, but if you're unlucky, this will lead to possible firing, eviction, or family abandonment. What makes Stonewall so famous is its spontaneity. What was supposed to be a typical police raid turned into a brawl because a bunch of queers said, "Fuck that," and fought back, resisting arrest and beating up cops until they fled. Although, I should point out, this wasn't the only event of its kind, and wasn't even the first event. Google Compton Cafeteria Riot if you want to know more. But Stonewall is the one everyone remembers. The Stonewall Rebellion is seen as the flashpoint for gay liberation in the US, when queer people said, hey, we can fight back, and we can win, and we don't have to take this.
It showed them that being gay didn't have to be this shameful thing that they had to hide in a dark mob-run club to pursue. Of course, I don't want to portray this time period as all kittens and rainbows and punching cops.
Many right-wing groups pushed back against strides LGBT groups were making towards visibility. Many of the laws, like the ones championed by Anita Bryant and Jerry Falwell, would have made it illegal to be an openly gay school teacher.
Luckily, most of these initiatives, because of queer activism, were defeated or later repealed, but in the 1980s and 90s, queer people still couldn't catch a break.
The AIDS crisis ravaged the population of queer people at the time, while those in power ignored that anything was happening or even cheered on that it was. Openly queer people often became pariahs because of fear and lack of information about the disease. Many feared that touching or just being in the same room as a gay person could infect you. Being out was a political action. The chant, out of the closet and into the streets, and silence equals death, became rallying cries because that was the reality for queer Americans at that time. In a world where even associating with a gay person made you a social pariah, being out and loud and proud about your identity was a radical political statement, and I'd argue that it still is. The US military in the 90s had a direct policy called Don't Ask, Don't Tell, where technically you could be gay in the military.
But if you were openly out or someone outed you against your will, you'd get the boot. And that policy didn't go away until 2011. 2011! I was a sophomore in high school when it was finally done away with. I know this video that's supposed to be about coming out is quickly turning into a history lesson, but it kind of has to be, because whenever I think about coming out and if it's something anyone should do, I think about all this historic context. I think about all of the queer people who came before me and how much they had to lose, and yet they were still willing to come out, even in spite of all of that. And unfortunately, another part of me thinks maybe they should have saved themselves the trouble. Just stay quiet. just stayed in the closet. I mean, you could argue that one advantage that queer people have that other disadvantaged groups lack is a lot of the time it's not immediately obvious that we are queer. A lot of us are assumed cis and straight. So maybe if people just stayed quiet, never found love, never acted gay, never acted too flamboyant, too loud, too much of whatever tips straight people off. Maybe if we all just lived quietly and we could just not bother and just keep on living. If you can call that living. 2014, I was 18, a freshly out baby gay, just moved to college and joining all the LGBT organizations, trying to make new friends. And one topic that we all loved to dish about, our coming out story. So how did you do it? What did they say? Oh, they were supportive? I love that for you, queen. Slay. Did we say slay in 2014? I can't remember. I'm gonna assume we did. Now, being that this was Texas almost 10 years ago, not everyone was out to the people they knew back home, and not everyone had happy stories. But there were a lot of funny stories. People would bake a cake that said I'm gay, or they'd make a PowerPoint. Some people would just accidentally blurt it out in a conversation with their parents. Some people, unfortunately, were outed by people that they trusted. And some people had exes who, once they were broken up, decided that it was their duty to tell their ex's parents. Like I said, not all happy stories. And when telling a family member or a close friend, you could get all kinds of reactions. Everything from just benignly accepting it, to laughing, to making a joke about how they always knew, to, well, when I told people I didn't want to be super theatrical about it, I was kind of worried if I was, that people wouldn't take me seriously and they would think it was some weird prank. Most of the time that I told people, I would just come up to them at school and say, hey, just so you know, I've been thinking about this for a while and I'm into girls and guys. The reactions I got from my friends were mostly shrugs. I mean, I had built this up as this grand event that was going to change my friendships. But by the time I was coming out, most of my friends had realized months or years ago that they were also queer and were constantly making jokes about how I was their token straight friend. And so the reaction that I got was less, OMG, yes, queen, live your truth, and more, oh honey, what took you so long? And as for my family, well, I'd rather not go there. Let's just say that their reactions were mostly benign, nothing life-threatening, nothing that traumatizing, just complicated. After I told people it wasn't this revolutionary thing that changed my whole life, I just felt lighter, more relaxed. I wasn't worried about my deep, dark secret that would be revealed to the world. I could just relax with friends and we could make jokes and talk about how hot Janelle Monáe is. Nowadays, most people know, or I assume they know, I live in a very queer-friendly city. I've surrounded myself with queer friends. I'm sure occasionally I worry about a certain coworker finding out, or maybe an extended family member, but it's also not something I feel the need to tell every single person like I did when I was younger. Most of my experiences with coming out have been fairly positive. I'm very pro coming out, and I think I've made a fairly good historic argument for why people should come out. With all that said, why do people stay in the closet? The two main arguments I've heard from people who don't want to come out are primarily privacy and safety. There are some people who feel like that's kind of private information that only people they're dating really need to know about. Some people feel like it's kind of awkward to bring that up around people they don't know well or their coworkers. Sometimes it just naturally doesn't come up in conversations and it feels kind of awkward to bring it up out of nowhere, like, hi, I'm a homo. And if you are someone who feels awkward bringing it up, that's fine. I've had situations, especially in my jobs, where I didn't bring it up just because it never naturally came up in conversation. I wasn't trying to hide my deep dark secret. I just never had a conversation with my coworkers about relationships, so why would I randomly bring that up? You don't have to be out to everyone. And you can choose not to be out to people just because you don't feel like telling them. The other reason is harder to reconcile with, and that is safety. I want to say off the bat, if you live with or are financially dependent on someone that you know will respond poorly or even violently to you coming out, it is 100% okay to stay in the closet. I would never ask someone to do something that would make them risk abuse or abandonment. LGBT teens have one of the highest percentages of homelessness due to family abandonment, and I am in favor of you doing anything that you have to do to not be homeless. If you are one of those people and you are watching this video, I just want you to know that you are not alone, that people want to support you, that there are online and in-person support groups that exist, and there are resources available to you, some of which I'll put down below. Please know that your situation is not forever.
Sadly, though, the threat to queer people does not stop at the interpersonal. As I briefly noted in my history discussion, from the early 20th century to today, having one's sexuality or gender known can put one in danger. Whether that's police raids on gay bars, bigots attacking queer people in the street, or the many civil liberties that queer people are still being denied or having taken away. And while I have mainly focused on the US because I am American and this is where I've done the most research, do not forget that there are many countries where homosexuality is a crime, punishable by years in prison, hard labor, or even death.
With all of the issues past and present that queer people are facing, I can totally imagine someone thinking that it's not worth it to come out, that they're better off in the closet. You know, this video is becoming a lot darker than I originally intended. I used to feel like everyone had this obligation to come out, that we owed it to the younger generation to be out and loud and proud and shout out of the closet and into the streets every opportunity that we got. And I really hope that I can be someone trustworthy for people that are younger than me, that in 10, 20, 30 years, the next generation of young little queers will see me as a safe person that they can come to. But I'm not naive to the fact that for a lot of people, it's not that simple. I am a cis white person who had enough education and money to move to Blue Rhode Island. And if I was stuck in my hometown in Texas, I'm not sure I would be so out loud and proud myself. It's also important to remember that being out or being in the closet is not a binary choice. You can be out with friends and closeted with family, or closeted at work and out with family, or any combination of friends, family, work, school, all of the above. And I hope whatever combination you are, there's at least someone that you can share your story with, even if that's just through typing it in the comments below. And if you are brave enough to do that, I promise that I will respond to anyone who shares their story with me. When I did my master's thesis, my research topic was on queer sexuality, and I interviewed several people for that, about coming out, about their identity, about their journey in their sexuality in general. I had them meet me for one-on-one interviews, and a lot of these people, the first time that we were meeting was for these interviews. Yet in a short hour or two, they were sharing very intimate details of their lives, sometimes things that they'd only shared with a few close friends or no one at all. I was pretty surprised by it at the time. I mean, that's what I was hoping for. That's what I wanted out of the interviews. But sometimes people were sharing very private information, and it just didn't make sense to me. After one of these interviews, me and the person I'd been interviewing were walking to the metro together, and I commented to her about how I was surprised at her candor, and I was curious how she felt comfortable sharing all of that. She told me that the fact that I had told her in the beginning of the interview that I was queer that I wanted to share queer stories. That made her comfortable revealing parts of herself to me, because she said, you're trying to tell our stories. And if we don't tell our stories to each other and share those stories, who else will? And you want to know the funny thing? She said that so casually, but that thought has always stuck with me. I'd like to finish this video with an excerpt from a speech by Harvey Milk. If you don't know who Harvey Milk was, he was the first openly gay US politician who was sadly gunned down by his bigoted coworker. He was a bright, passionate, funny person who really cared about this subject. And he had this speech that he would often give at rallies that goes like this.
Somewhere in Des Moines or San Antonio, there's a young gay person who all of a sudden realizes that she or he is gay, knows that if the parents find out, they'll be tossed out of the house. The classmates would taunt the child, and the Anita Bryans and John Briggs are doing their bit on TV, and that child had several options. Staying in a closet, suicide, and then one day that child might open a paper and it says homosexual elected in San Francisco, and there are two new options. The option is to go to California, and stay in San Antonio and fight. 2 days after I was elected, I got a phone call, and the voice was quite young. It was from Altoona, Pennsylvania. And the person said, thanks. And you've got to elect gay people so that that young child and the thousands upon thousands like that child know that there's hope for a better world. There's hope for a better tomorrow. Without hope, not only gays, but those blacks and the Asians, and the disabled, the seniors, the us's. The us's. Without hope, the us's give up. I know that you cannot live on hope alone, but without it, life is not worth living. And you've got to give them hope. Thank you very much.